Share my screen. Go ahead and share my screen now. All right.
Looks good. Oh, and if you have a question for Johnny, I think you can take a few questions during the presentation, or you can stick them in the chat, and I'll kind of keep an eye on that for you.
Yeah, whichever way is best. So yeah, I'm Johnnie Speicher. I graduated from Ohio State in 2019 with a bachelor's, and then went on and pursued a master's and graduated in almost a year ago in January 2023. I started my job at OEFFA almost a full year ago again, and last November. I'm one of the 3 Sustainable Agriculture Educators. So yeah, I'll get into a little bit more about me here in a second and get into my research and specifically kind of the lessons I learned from that research during that time. So I was looking at some root and shoot zone heating effects on fall time carrot and lettuce growth and quality grown in a high tunnel environment. So I kind of shortened the title up a little bit, but overall, a lot of my slides are going to be the same as how I left them. So a little bit about me. I'm a 4th generation farmer. I still live on my family's farm in Stark County, Ohio. So not too far from Worcester, where I was doing my research. I'd consider myself a 1st generation researcher, because before me, my dad and grandfather and great grandfather hadn't attended college or got any advanced degrees. But really, I could change that to 4th generation researcher because, over the years of farming, I think my grandfather and father have done plenty of their own research. But I am a 1st generation researcher in terms of being controlled research. So, I kind of apply my farm and research knowledge towards my job every day. It helped define me. I believe Matt K on here is Matt Kleinhens. He was my advisor through my time. And he told me that if graduate school didn't change you and change your way of thinking, then, there was no real point of attending. And it definitely did change how I thought and how I looked at the world. And that's something I'll get into. So anyway, kind of to start out, high tunnels borrow from both greenhouse and open field environments. There's some extreme temperature shifts in a field setting, and the crops often, grown in the ground. However, like greenhouses, high tunnels offer some protection from wind, rain, the environment. They utilize the greenhouse effect to warm up. There's no cooling system in a high tunnel versus a greenhouse generally, or generally no lighting system besides the sun. Soil floors are subjected to heat from surrounding soil in high tunnels and have extremely limited insulating properties. Because of the greenhouse effect, they can heat up faster compared to field environments. The main difference between high tunnels and greenhouses is that high tunnel conditions cannot be standardized. It is extremely active endeavor for a grower. They must be present to vent the high tunnel if it becomes too hot, or apply a row cover when it gets too cold. High tunnels also create a large feedback loop. Weather and high tunnel management influences high tunnel conditions. These conditions, along with crop physiology, influence the cropping outcomes. These cropping outcomes then in turn influence management strategies. One big feedback loop. High tunnel management can take a while to learn and often at great cost to growers. The point of my research with Matt was to kind of speed up this feedback loop to make it easier on growers to learn some of these challenges and get better cropping outcomes. And in turn, the hope is to equal better strategies and more money. So, although the high tunnel and microenvironment manipulation studies have kind of been conducted throughout the scientific community before, in Matt's lab specifically, there has been some studies before me looking at similar, activities. But, do high tunnel growers really understand these complex dynamics involved? Decisions around the selection and use of common practices and tools are, not always clear or primarily data driven. And that's what we wanted here. So I completed this study in the fall of 2019, fall of 2020. It was going to have a springtime component until COVID hit, and we had issues completing that springtime and being kind of kicked off campus, and we just kind of dropped it and made it a fall-time endeavor. So the project consisted of 2 studies. One consists of monitoring and assessing cropping outcomes, which was the lettuce and carrots in the different microenvironments we created. And one was kind of assessing some of the environmental data that we were looking at, which was primarily soil and air temperature in and around the crop and in the tunnel as a whole. So the experiment was performed in just a basic high tunnel. And it was done in raised beds of different heights. You can kind of see here what they looked like. I applied some root zone heating with electric cables. We had to go through and remove the top layer of the soil down to, I forget how deep. I think about 15 centimeters. We laid in the cables and kind of spaced them out as best as we could, as the ruler kind of shows, and then covered them back up. Here we are seeding them after we did all that. So I kind of bisected the beds right through the middle. And we planted carrots on one side, lettuce on the other, different spacings. Then we also went through and thinned them a little bit to get the proper dimensions. And at this slide, I'm going to stop and say that, this technical aspect of research was something that as an undergrad, I didn't learn a lot about. We learned a lot about plant sciences in general, what makes crops grow, how they grow, different aspects like that. But coming from a farming background, I was more focused on the farming side, the practical side. So when I came to this research environment and everything was very technical and I had to take very good notes, and all of these little aspects made a big difference, like the planting, how far apart things were, how deep the cables were, what kind of seed I was using. This is when it started to click that, as Matt said, we were trying to adjust my farmer brain into a researcher brain and get them to coincide together. And it, as I'll talk about later in the presentation, it really had an impact on how I view farming, the world around me, and just research overall, and my ability to critically think. So, here's some of what we can consider technology used for influencing the microenvironment after I planted these carrots and lettuce. I have the soil heating cables here. That's generally kind of what they looked like before they went in the ground. We used some perforated plastic row cover and then a fabric row cover as well. That kind of made up my 4 treatments that I went with. They also had a component of time. So treatment 1 was a control. It didn't have any cables, no coverings during the day, which would have been a plastic covering, and no fabric covering at night. It was just completely open to the high tunnel environment. Treatment 2 had the heat cables plugged in during the day and a fabric at night. Treatment 3 had the perforated film during the day, and of course it was left during the night with the fabric. And treatment 4 kind of combined everything, where I had the perforated film, the cable during the day, and the fabric at night. Just to get into, again, a little more technical terms of the actual research. It was a randomized complete block design, 5 reps, 4 beds a rep. We kind of had to mix in those tall and short beds just to kind of see how they interacted and if that made a difference. Then we kind of randomized the crop subplots to where they were exposed in the tunnel, whether they were on the outer edge or toward the middle. Daily treatments usually began right on the 14th. Got pretty lucky with the planting days from year to year. It was about 1 week after seeding, and we continued it for 8 weeks over the course of the fall. So 28 days after seeding or 23 days after treatment, that's when we went through and thinned out to the desired population so things weren't too crowded. You can see how we were going through and clipping off tiny little carrots or pulling out little tiny lettuces. I also have the sampling area quadrants, you know, so I could achieve an appropriate level of what we would consider the harvestable unit. So there's actually 2 quadrants, because one we harvested at 7 weeks and one we harvested at 9 weeks. And that's kind of what the red line shows in that picture there. So here is that harvest schedule. So harvest 1, it was 46 and 47 days after seeding, or 41 and 42 days after the treatments were applied, respectively, in 2019 and 2020. And again, we were looking at the root zone environment and the shoots where the leaves were growing. So we had to go through and we pulled these lettuce and little tiny carrots, as you can kind of see in the bottom here. They got very, very small roots at this point, but we had to go through and try to get all those roots out so we could examine them. Harvest 2 was 2 weeks later. And again, the carrots got a little bit bigger, the lettuce was a little bit bigger, and we took them into the head house to examine them. As you can see, some people have gloves on. We got gloves over gloves. Anyone who's been in a high tunnel environment in December kind of knows it's hit or miss. It can be very warm because you have the nice plastic to keep you warm, or if you're harvesting in the morning like us, it was very cold and the ground was very cold on the hands. So for the data collection, we would get a fresh weight of the whole plot. We measured all that together. We broke that down to a subsample because there was kind of a lot we harvested, so we needed to speed things up a little bit. So we took a subsample of 16 carrots and 4 lettuce plants, and that was a quarter of the overall amount. So we then separated the roots and shoots so we could get their weights. Then we measured root length and the crown diameter, which on the carrots was kind of right under where the color right under the shoulder to where it started to turn orange from the stem. We got a leaf area, a dry weight, and then a Brix, which would be considered total soluble solids. That's the sugar content in the crop. And for Brix, we did that only at the last harvest in week 9. And of course, for carrots, and lettuce, we did it on the harvestable unit. So we didn't take Brix on carrot leaves or on lettuce roots because we didn't really need that data. And then we took some non-destructive pictures throughout the experiment. So some of the results here, might skip over some of this stuff, but anyway, this kind of gets into the environmental data we were looking at. We were looking for growing degree units, which is a smaller measurement of what some people might know as growing degree days. It's often used a lot in agronomy for corn. So that's where, many of you might have heard it, but past research has kind of narrowed that down to hours and units. And that's what we wanted to look at, because if you're looking at a plant growing and you think of a growing degree day, that is taking the overall temperature, minus what its lowest temperature can grow at. A plant isn't waiting an entire day for that calculation to go ahead and grow. Plants are growing in the moment, that they are above their growing degree unit. So we were able to break it down to 15-minute summations, and I will get into that here. So here is some of our growing degree unit accumulation over time. And I used it as days after the treatment initiation. We also used a base of 3.33 degrees, and in the literature, that's what we showed to have the lowest point at which carrots will continue to grow. And then I also believe I have one for lettuce, which was 4.44 degrees. But anyway, as you can see here, the dashed lines represent 2020 data. The solid lines are 2019. They go by color. Blue was treatment 1, which would be this lower line. Treatment 2 was green and treatment 3 was yellow. They're kind of represented here. And then the last treatment, which if you remember was everything combined, is this higher one. So we can see some clear separation between the treatments in terms of growing degree accumulation. So the thermal time over these days after treatment initiation was way higher, and we kind of see that applied here later to plant growth. We're all some pictures comparing everything. I believe this is, sorry, I have my share screen kind of blocking some of this. I believe this slide was the air accumulation, this one was soil. And again, so treatment 2 and treatment 4 is where the heating cables were applied. So we did growing degree units of just soil temperature, and you can see how much higher the soil temperature was over time. Here's some more average air and soil temperatures for treatments over the entire experimental period. This just kind of sums up what we saw in the other graphs. Skip through some of this. So anyway, here we get into some of how that got applied to the plants, these different treatments. These are some of the carrots before the final harvest in December. So you can see treatment 1, how small those carrot tops were. Treatment 2 and 3 are very similar. And then treatment 4 was definitely the highest. Here you can see that effect with the lettuce. My experiment didn't solely get into any of the red color that you might see in this lettuce, which would be the anthocyanin production. Past research in our lab did. I used a red variety, but didn't get into that. But you can definitely see where treatment 1 with no coverings were a lot more red than what treatment 4 kind of showed. Here we see the carrot roots. I did grow what was considered a true baby carrot of the Adelaide variety, but they still didn't completely fill out in those 9 weeks to exactly how big they should have gotten. But for our purpose, we do still see some differences in the overall growth. Here is some pictures of the lettuce as well. Again, you can definitely tell where treatment 4, you were getting closer to a true harvestable unit of lettuce. And this was considered a mini romaine variety. And in this case, treatment 4 actually got to what we were looking for. So at this point, I have some more data that I can show toward the end, but I'm going to get into some of my lessons from my research. As I said, being a farmer and one not exposed to much research over my life, some of the lessons I learned throughout this project. So, one of the big ones is just how I view the world around me. I definitely have a more critical lens now toward when someone says something to me or when someone quotes something to me. If someone's, sending me information, I look at that with a more critical eye than I once did. It doesn't just have to be farming related or plant science related. But just in general, this picture of the high tunnel before I started helps sum it up. Because now, when I first walked into a high tunnel when I joined Matt's lab, this is what I saw. I just saw a high tunnel. I saw a place where you could grow stuff, outside of a traditional growing season. Now, when I look at it, my eyes are instantly going to like, how high are the sidewalls? How open are the doors? All of that's playing a role on the temperature gradient profile across this entire high tunnel. Where are we actually positioning the crops? It's going to be colder toward the edges of those tunnels than it is in the middle. I remember Matt and I had plenty of conversations about, if we had more money to buy more thermometers, how would we position them in this tunnel? Where would you position them? Because to tell a grower, you should have a thermometer in your tunnel, where should they actually have one to get a true glimpse of what their tunnel temperature is? We often hung ours just kind of right in the middle here, kind of hanging down. And that's kind of where we determined to be the best for what I was doing. But really, it was great to have one in every single bed so you could see the temperature profile. But if growers had money for just one, where would they put it? Toward the middle of my experiment, I started to notice this tree right over here was starting to shade stuff out. I don't believe it had much of an impact across my separate reps, but again, if I'm advising a grower on high tunnel positioning, now I'm definitely thinking about all of those factors. I view the world in examining processes and systems a little differently now. All the different inputs and factors that can be applied to something. I try to think of those because it's generally not just one thing that's making a process go. There's a lot of factors involved. And this is one of them. Before, I used to just think that you could go ahead and plant something in the field. You got a certain amount of days it would grow for the most part. But from year to year, there's a lot of different factors. You got different weather, you got different management styles. It doesn't necessarily just have to be in a high tunnel system. But then you have different crop genes and physiology, and those are all working together to get your cropping outcome. And so when when growers are discussing systems with me, it's like, well, what exactly are you doing? What exactly are you applying? How are you treating it? When are you doing some sort of tillage? What are you applying in terms of fertilizer? Did you have a soil test? All those factors are coming together now. Things that I know my dad and grandpa did, but I didn't think about the why so much. I just knew it had to be done. So one of my biggest lessons was how to be a better farmer for myself, and then also how to help farmers with their own endeavors. So being able to view these systems approaches differently, being able to think of things through a more critical lens, allows me to take what farmers ask me and help them kind of get the best answers for their system. Every system is going to be different. Every farmer is going to be different. Again, they have different factors in their life, where they are, all of that. So overall, it's just kind of making me a better farmer, making me a better educator, and whether I continue with any sort of research, which I did get sucked into this group. Julia's shoes were big shoes to fill, but I guess I can't get too far from research. I always told myself I was never going to get a PhD, but it's funny how research sucks you back in a little bit, whether it's actually doing that in an act in practice or just being on this farmer researcher network and helping other farmers figure that out. So that's what I think I'm going to enjoy about it, is helping farmers kind of come to these conclusions, whether they're taking a graduate program or not. I was there at one point. I viewed things through my farmer lens, and I definitely had to get, I got a lot of coaching over my years as a graduate student on how to think differently and how to view this a little differently and how to, sometimes you can't look at it as a farmer, you're going to look at it as a researcher. And when you find those answers to those questions, then you can apply it back to your practice. So I like being able to mediate between the sciences that a lot of our land grant universities are doing, being able to interpret the research that I see, and being able to help growers better understand that. I very much enjoy that aspect of my job. So yeah, I have a bunch of other slides that are less exciting because they're very number based, but if anyone wants any more details, we can discuss it, or I can go back to any other aspects, or you can quiz me on, what I learned. So
Johnny, I've got a question. I like those slides you showed that showed the different masses of the plant growth. So is there an advantage or not of just eyeballing it and looking at things like that versus the kind of detailed research that you've done? What are the advantages of going to all that extra work?
yeah. Well, that's good, because it did kind of lead into these slides that I didn't show. So the eyeball test is beneficial in some regards, but as you go through an eyeball test, it can be misleading because you want a significant difference in most cases in science to actually prove that something's working. That is what I got in my numbers here. We can show. So most of the time, and this would be just fresh weight of the whole crop. That's what I'll go with instead of breaking it down further. But treatment 4 was always significantly different from treatment 1. A lot of times, if you're looking in the literature, it'll be displayed this way. You have a least significant difference number, and then you'll see these little letters besides the numbers. So if the letter's different, it was significantly different. As you can see, with treatment 2 and 3, occasionally, like at 7 weeks after seeding and carrot, it wasn't significantly different. As time went on to 9 weeks, it became significantly different. And you can see in lettuce that it didn't grow out of that for treatment 2 and 3. However, treatment 4, and we can go back to the eyeball test, and we can kind of see it here, where treatment 4 was always bigger than treatment 1, 2, and 3, and it always had more weight, had more fresh weight. So it might be a little harder to see between 2 and 3, which the numbers kind of prove that they're very similar. So the eyeball test can be okay, but it might mislead you from year to year. Whereas when you actually have the number with the math and you have a significant difference, you can kind of compare that year to year to actually see if what you're doing is working. I think, when I go back to say that I'm a first generation researcher, but really my dad and grandpa doing research, their research is the eyeball test from year to year, saying like, oh, this does look better. And I think a lot of farmers do that now, but again, without taking notes and out with recording data, it's hard to actually prove that to yourself or to anyone else, which is why the scientific community takes this approach. So
I can see that being helpful for a farmer too, if they're looking at the economics too.
yeah.
You get some quantification of the results. Deb, go ahead and we'll have your questions.
So a couple of questions quickly. Who funded this research, your research, Johnny?
To be fair, I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to ask Matt and Joe. I forget what grant it was through in my time. So that was the one thing I didn't have to focus on much, was finding my own grant money.
Right. No, I wouldn't expect that as a grant, but I'm curious. I would like to know if this was part of an OREI grant or something something else. The other question I have is what does it in terms of cost benefits to to farmers? So treatment 4 clearly has a production benefit, but it does, I'm sure it comes at some cost. Can you address that?
Yeah, so I didn't go much into the economic side of, how much you could get more per fresh weight of like a lettuce or carrot. And I kind of just had a general idea of how much extra it cost to apply the technology. But, with kind of limited resources as a graduate student, limited time on what to be focused on, the economics is one side we didn't get into very much. We kind of wanted growers to see if it would, kind of pencil out the math for themselves by looking at the numbers. Overall, I would say, like, generally, I think it could have, it could be beneficial to a farmer's bottom line to use this technology. In terms of like a plastic row cover and a fabric row cover, sometimes a lot of growers already have a fabric row cover that they're using. The plastic is not overall that much more expensive. It wasn't a very big time commitment. It would take me usually 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the afternoon to uncover and cover the beds back up. So it wasn't a big time commitment because, growers are generally going to be checking on their crop anyway. So if you kind of do it that time, the heating cables themselves, I didn't do any studies on how much power. I mean, I knew how much power they were pulling, but I didn't convert that into, the price per kilowatt hour from a company. And that Ohio State, I'm not sure where I would have found how much it was using actually, since it was just all into the grid of the farm over there in Worcester. But those cords aren't pulling a ton of power to make them unreasonable. And that was more or less just to show the benefits of a subsoil heating. There was a lot of other studies and different growers that I've heard of that were using, wood burners. Growers would put like big water tubes under their soil and heat it that way, like kind of people heat their houses. Some people would just put, heaters in tunnels as they were instead of covering them up. So this was just to show kind of how changing these temperatures could benefit your crop overall. If I could go back and do it, I would do an economic study on it, because that was one of the first things my grandpa asked me. He was more interested on whether it could make money. So
you probably still could come up. I'm sorry, you probably still could come up with an estimate.
Yes.
And I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
It's going to be seat of the pants, but yeah, I would really like to see that. I know, you're not an economist, all those caveats, but you are a farmer. And so, you have a platform to speak from there.
Yeah, it would definitely be easier to do the expenses in terms of, what I applied to get this. And I could get a general idea of the overall value, but of course, from area to area within Ohio and, region to region, it's going to be different. If you're in the Cleveland, Columbus market, the benefit of having some lettuce that you're harvesting before Christmas is probably going to outweigh maybe the Worcester area. But again, that's a number I could find out, and then growers can kind of determine if it makes sense for their market.
Well, thank you. Very, very interesting. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Are there like enterprise budgets available for this kind of production, or do we, like, I know there's some out there for organic grains or grains in general, but I'm not sure about specialty crop production, where you can kind of plug in some of your numbers and see how the bottom line turns out.
I'm not too sure. I didn't come across anything overall. I mean, I came across a lot of figures about how much it would to be, start up a high tunnel, and whether you can get like an NRCS grant to help cover some of the cost of that. Those numbers are out there, but then all those other, little factors that were in play, I didn't see much of. So
I think it'd be harder to do than for a row crop because there's more factors and more variation, but something like that could be a really useful tool for a farmer to evaluate.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry.
I think the specialty crop just sector in general is maybe a little behind on some of those factors, and maybe that's because of I feel the markets are a little more diverse and there's so many other crops that you're growing within that realm. So
yep. Cool. Nice comment from Brian in here about using some different technology to kind of take measurements. He's saying they use some old cell phones as cameras and to kind of look at those. Is that, would that maybe be easier for a grower to kind of look at it over time if they are just doing the eyeball test?
yeah, so I mean, I don't have the the pictures in here. I just have that, 9 weeks after seeding pictures.
Mm-hmm.
But I just took pictures on my iPhone.
Yeah.
Over the course, like weekly. So, we had a program where you could kind of plug in some pictures and it would show you the percent of crop growth over time. And so you could plug in weekly pictures and kind of see that. But you could just apply that, to your own eyeball test. Go through, take a picture every week from the same angle. That's what I did. Just held it over the plot. And then, yeah, you would see some of the differences. So.
Some other questions from folks? It's a nice comment in the chat from, I don't know who it is, someone on a Galaxy phone. Are there some other crops that this would work for, do you think, or crops that maybe you wouldn't expect to be successful?
It's definitely centered around like leafy greens or maybe some fall root crops, especially during this time of year. I think to stretch a tomato to December, you're going to be doing a lot more greenhouse type activity to be able to do that. So most of the research around this time of year that I conducted, I know past research in the lab kind of focused on I think pak choi, other types of lettuce, spinach, those kind of crops. So I think any leafy green type vegetable it would work for. Carrots, again, it kind of showed it worked. It would have been interesting, of course, in research, if you had more time and more money, you see, but I had to follow what I did the first year and the second year. But if I could do it again, maybe I would start the carrots 2 weeks earlier in the fall season, because maybe then by December 10th, it would actually fill out to a full carrot. So we did prove the fact that having the different technology and having the heating cables did make the carrots significantly bigger, but we didn't really show that you could fill out a full carrot. So.
Other questions out there? I can keep on asking questions. What company made the electric cables for this? Can you give some more details on some of those materials?
I thought I had the name at one point. So the perforated film you can kind of find anywhere. Like I think Johnny Selected Seed sells it. The fabric was just Agribon. I mean, that's the trade name for it. A lot of growers can find that. And they have it in different weights. It's like a heavy weight, a lightweight, and then they have like an insect net kind of weight. Again, the perforated film is out there. A lot of people are doing low tunnel kind of stuff. So I can go back and show where the low tunnels themselves were. They had these wire hoops over them. That's kind of what pushed up the plastic. So those were kind of just homemade. They had been there. You can do this in the soil. It doesn't have to be in a raised bed either. That's just how we kind of controlled it, made it a little easier. And then the heating cables themselves, I forget the exact manufacturer, but soil heating cables are kind of hard to find now, especially thermostatically controlled ones. The ones I had were supposed to kick on at a certain temperature and control themselves, but we found that because of their age, that wasn't working. So we had to advise it, which is why we would turn them off at night because it was actually getting the soil pretty hot. So we kind of toned that down to just actively heating during the day. Again, this research could have been done reverse. You could have used the sun to heat the soil during the day and at night put the cables on. And then you would add heating at 2 stages. But a lot of the times you can still find these if you wanted to use them, but they're going to be listed as snow melting cables for roofs. People put them on their roofs to melt snow. But specific brand, I kind of forget. I think we had a couple factors. But again,
if someone wanted to look, they'd look for snow melting cables.
I believe this year at the OEFFA conference, there may be someone discussing underground heating of their high tunnel system. Potentially. You can't quote me on that till we finalize everything. But
hello. That might be me. I'm talking about heating and cooling high tunnels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so I'll be talking about a shallow geothermal system. So we had to do an excavation outside the high tunnel.
That was what I was gonna lead into, where the soil heating cables is just one way of doing it. There's plenty of other ways of heating the soil. Like I said, a lot of people are doing obviously like a geothermal or using like hot water systems. So you don't have to solely rely on just electric heating cables.
It does work best for like a high tunnel situation since it's a little easier to get at it.
It worked best in our situation in the raised beds because you could kind of separate them out. Now it seems like a hot water system would be best on a tunnel wide basis. Because you can kind of hit the whole thing. But the way we were doing it, these obviously work best because we could zone them out.
Other questions people have? I have 2 more. Can you get things too hot? It sounds like you can. And how does this affect other things in the ag system, like microbial activity and pest and disease issues?
Yeah, I mean, so we didn't look too much into microbial activity. We didn't dig into the soil or do any of that. But it definitely probably could impact it. You can't get too hot. I mean, that's why we had to start unplugging the soil cables because, we had them plugged in for a little while on that first run of the experiment, and the soil was like pushing 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're like, oh, that might have some negative effects over time. So we revised it from there. And we would also, especially in the early part of the fall, as the tunnel would get warmed up, if it was starting to push kind of over, I want to say 85 degrees Fahrenheit, we started opening the sides of the tunnel and the doors to see if it would cool it down. But there were days where that greenhouse effect was just making the tunnel too hot, and you would have to vent the plastic open as well. Usually they were all the way down, kind of like in this picture. You can see this is along the soil. We had them along the bed. We would have them, down along the edge of the bed, trying to minimize that gap as much as possible. But some days it would just get very, very hot under there, and you would have to kind of lift the plastic up to vent them out. But we were trying to maximize the heat gain, and we were trying to limit losing any of that over time. In terms of disease pressure, as you can kind of see on the perforated plastic, that it did build up some condensation. So it was a very humid, moist environment. I luckily didn't have many problems with any fungal diseases or many pest diseases besides some mice. There was some mice that trimmed along the edges of some of the lettuce. Luckily, it wasn't really in the plots. It was just the guard rows, so they did their job. But I could see where if you weren't kind of venting these open and letting them air out, you could get some fungal pressure.
Any other questions? Johnny, you talked a little bit about switching back and forth between like a farmer perspective and a researcher perspective. What's the biggest part of that switch?
You know, it's so ingrained in me now, it's hard to remember what it was like before having the researcher perspective in there. The farmer perspective was definitely centered just like everything had a practical lens. Like, would this even work practically? And you know, like a money lens, and everything centered around just overall practicality, which is good to have. I mean, that it was actually useful to apply to research. I think it made for better research overall than just being strictly trying to see one little thing out of the experiment. But the researcher side brought in a more critical lens, and, you know, observe some of these factors that I wouldn't have thought would make a difference, that, you know, ended up making a difference or could have made a difference overall. And I think that was the best part about learning that side, is now I can examine things that maybe seemingly don't seem like they would have an impact, but potentially could. And again, that's the great part about research, is unless you're doing it, you might not know. And that's what's fun about research, is you're finding the answers. And from what I saw with my time at Ohio State, that's really what drives people who make careers out of research, is they love finding answers to these problems. And I found quite a bit of joy in it myself, and I still find it fun to, you know, seek out answers to problems. So